Perhaps Ralph and Michael could join me up here at the table, and we'll entertain questions from the floor as well as from our webcast audience. Please find a microphone if you have a question, or one will be brought to you quickly. Okay, in the back, if you can find a microphone. You had a question?
Chit van Staak.
Yourself, please.
Yeah, Chit van Staak, Clinical Practice Research Data Link. I very much enjoyed the presentations. I have two questions which are related. It's to do about blinding and placebo control. Because, I mean, in typical trials, you blind, you have placebo controls. Of course, in a large, simple trial, it would be much more difficult because you would need to recruit pharmacies that stock all the placebo tablets. So probably in large, simple trials, blinding isn't all possible. These trials will be open. Do you agree with that? And my second question relates to patient-reported outcomes, specifically questionnaires, etc. If you have an open study, it's much more difficult in an open study to measure things like patient-reported outcomes because of the lack of blinding. It's much easier if you, let's say, measure death because you don't need to be blinded as an investigator to diagnose that. So what are your views on that?
So it's certainly a lot easier to do unblinded trials, and the GISI trial was an unblinded trial. It was in that respect, it was also very simple, but it could be an unblinded trial in part because the endpoint, mortality, was so unambiguous. I think that's something that we ought to talk about during these next 2 days, because I'm not entirely convinced that it's impossible to do a large simple trial that's not placebo controlled. And that's something, that's a great question, and it's definitely worth talking about. Now, patient-reported outcomes can certainly be done at a very large scale, and that is a separate question from blinding. One could have a placebo-controlled trial with a patient-reported outcome, where the patients themselves are blinded to what treatment they're actually getting, and they report out whatever they report out. So I'm not sure that is inherently a problem.
If I could just make a quick comment, it is frequently stated that when mortality, as you point out, an endpoint for which physicians can generally agree, when mortality is not an endpoint in the trial, that blinding occupies a very central role in the internal validity of the study. And so as we begin to move away from those features that help to ensure or strengthen the internal validity, we begin to have trade-offs that are inevitable in the quality and credibility of evidence. But I agree with Michael that one of our challenges is to begin to find ways to do studies that are not reliant solely on death as an endpoint and yet still retain those features that protect the internal validity. So I think it's one of the challenges that we face, but an absolutely critical one to ensure that large simple trials actually meet the goal of the original design.
Rob?
Yeah, thanks. Those were great presentations.
Identify yourself.
Rob Califf, Duke University. I have one question for you and then two sort of taunts, that one of which I'm sure Dr. Temple will want to take on. But the question is, when I talk about this now, the most frequent question I get from almost everybody is, wait a minute, I thought we're headed the other direction. We've been sold on personalized medicine. GSK itself has done a lot of stuff. All of our academic centers are advertising it. I thought the goal was to reduce the cost of these trials by doing very tiny targeted trials that show big effects. And in oncology, as you know, over 80% of trials don't even have a control group because there's a feeling that if you target the therapy enough, you can know the answer. So how do you reconcile these two divergent things? Personally, I have a quibble with the word large as part of this, because I don't think the issue is really how big the study is. The study ought to be big enough to answer the question, but some of those could be moderate size or even small. I think the key is simple, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that. And the two taunts are, which I know are going to come up throughout the next day and a half. Do you really, it seems like our practice community is rapidly moving the other direction. The interest in doing research is at a low point in the U.S. and heading the wrong direction, just as the intellectual activity is pointing to the need to integrate practice and research. So what are you going to do about that? And second is the role of the regulators, who of course are the source of all of our problems, with the need to have reams and reams of data just in case somebody might ask about a question and you didn't have any data about it.
I was told, Rob, it was my turn to go first. So as you know better than I, what constitutes large, of course, is driven more by the number of endpoints than by the number of people you start with. And so if you have a sufficient number of endpoints to answer the question, the size of the trial is probably adequate for the purposes that it was designed for. But I absolutely agree with you about the issue of complexity of the trial. So in the environment in which I am now, in the pharmaceutical industry, we collect reams of data that are never, ever examined or analyzed for any purpose whatsoever. They're collected, they're there. No, they do it in part out of habit. They do it in part because they legitimately feel that that data may be needed to address a question of safety that may emerge either unexpectedly or even expectedly. And there's a tremendous sense of responsibility to be able to adequately analyze safety issues as they occur. And they do blame Bob as when all else fails. It's Bob Temple that is responsible for collecting a lot of unwanted data.
Rachel,
so
actually.
I think it is going to require that we get much more precise about what the question is we're asking and about our tolerance for risk on the other side of the design and analysis. And I think that that's a perfectly legitimate place to be, that we have to be prepared to accept a greater degree of risk of uncertainty than we have up to now. One last comment, and that is the so-called personalized or stratified medicine approach. It doesn't need to have exquisite N of 1 analyses to provide greater refinement in the way in which we understand the targeting of treatments for particular patients, and we can make enormous strides in understanding treatment heterogeneity by just collecting targeted information that really is relevant to the therapy that we're undertaking.
No, I think that there's a certain irony, which is that in order to learn about what works best in individual patients, that's all the more reason why we really need large numbers. The large is really critically important. It's not just the simple, because it is by having large numbers of endpoints that one can come up with robust estimates that are likely to represent true findings. And so if we want to know what works best in various subgroups of patients, we need those subgroups to be really large. So I think that in order to move in that direction, that's all the more reason why we need even larger trials. So that in really large trials, the subgroups themselves are legitimately large. They would be legitimate topics of trials themselves. You saw this recent example of the Accord trial, the Accord lipid trial, that seemed to suggest that people with a high triglyceride and a low HDL benefit from getting fibrates. That was a subgroup analysis, and there was a very nice perspective piece that was written in the New England Journal that pointed out that the next step would be to do a follow-up trial. And that follow-up trial would look at the subgroup to see whether or not this result could be reproduced. Well, just imagine if the original trial, instead of involving 5,000 patients, had involved 50,000 patients. If it involved that number, we'd have the answer, because the subgroup itself would be adequately powered to come up with a result that we could actually believe. I think another critical point here is, look at the people who are sitting up here. We've got a gentleman from industry, I'm from the government, and he's from academia. And the idea that we're all singing the same tune here, that there's a critical need to change the way in which we do trials, make them large and simple, that's a very powerful message. And And Bob will speak in a moment. But I think that one of the critical parts here is that we are all converging on the critical need to move in this direction from multiple different sectors of the research enterprise. And I see Rick Kuntz is also nodding his head. And that's really a very important part of all this.
So as often the case, Bob Temple will get the last word, or at least the last question.
Actually, I guess what struck me is that we're lumping a whole lot of things that aren't necessarily all the same together. So the concept of a large, simple trial could include one in which you got very detailed baseline information, but didn't see everybody constantly and didn't do a lot of tests every day and had relatively straightforward endpoints. But for example, and I mean, the original concept of the large, simple trial was that everybody's going to move in the same direction, just as Ralph said. But we no longer believe that anymore. We think there are genomic and other characteristics that might matter. But a large, simple trial could collect that stuff. They don't have to be all the same. And then you've sort of been talking as if mortality endpoints are the easy game, and that's true. But there could be other endpoints. If people were really interested in enrolling their patients and in being in them, they could do all kinds of things. They could have PROs, they could have other tests. So it isn't a single modality. It's use of a system to collect the stuff that can be collected, but it doesn't inhibit you from doing other things and adding them in, and it would still be unbelievably cheap in comparison, even to randomize from populations that are already in a system would be an enormously simple thing. And people have been talking about getting consent online. Once you leave the mortality findings, though, and you insist on blinding, I mean, there is the problem of whether you need a placebo, whether a placebo can be done in this setting, and all that kind of stuff that has to be come to grips with. If people really want to know the answers, I think they could. I mean, what I want to know is what works for back pain. We spend untold trillions of dollars on it. We don't know if any of them work. Let's do that and find out. Well, it's not mortality, but it's still stuff you could find out. So I think it's very exciting, but it's very important to recognize the wide variety of different components of these large, simple interventions. They're not all going to be the same.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And to echo that, this device is not only a telephone and it's not only a camera, but it has been used, for example, by economists and sociologists to do some fascinating research in which their research subjects, often in the hundreds of thousands to millions, get asked questions like, what are you doing right now? Daniel Kahneman did a very interesting study where he would send people text messages and say, what kind of mood are you in right now from 1 to 10? And then what are you doing right now? And he was able to collect data from tens of thousands of people, if not more than that. And by the way, he found out that one of the things that we really don't like doing is commuting to work, which this is apropos for Washington. But it's a point here, and your point brings up the concept that by leveraging the digital revolution, there's all kinds of stuff that we can do, and we can do it in at very large scales and at low cost.
And final question. Otherwise, we have used up our allotted time.
You've got a couple, there's a queue over here.
All right, go ahead. We have time for one question.
So I'll be quick. Gail Pearson, NHLBI. I work with Michael Auer. As is often the case, I agree with Rob Califf, and as a pediatric cardiovascular researcher, I'm a little bit worried about the term large, simple trials. And I've been thinking about this more recently because of JAMA's call for papers on pediatric research. Their call criticized conventional pediatric research in many arenas. So I'm wondering if those of you up at the front have given any thought to simple trials in smaller populations that are often healthier. In pediatric cardiology, for example, we think a 550-person trial is enormous. And thank you for the very fascinating talks.
So actually, I've admired my pediatric colleagues, especially in pediatric oncology, who have really, I think, set the standard for the way in which you can advance therapeutics with very elegantly designed, relatively small trials that answer very focused questions. And I expect actually that we will continue to see that evolve in similar ways, where incremental advances in care will be based on both large, simple studies, the kind that we're discussing here, but also very focused studies of smaller samples that are able to take advantage of biological advances that do refine the ability to ask and answer relevant questions. So I think we're going to see a convergence in both types of designs.
One last question, we must move on.
Joanne Manson, Boston. I just want to respond to that comment about placebo control. And it definitely is possible to do placebo-controlled large, simple trials. I'm going to show you several examples in the next session. And also this concern that you can't really look at certain outcomes, such as certain non-fatal outcomes, unless you have a placebo control, but mortality is an acceptable outcome. I'd actually play devil's advocate on that, because even though mortality obviously is a very hard outcome to be assessing, if there are non-fatal events or medical conditions that could be influenced by knowing that you're that you're getting active care, or you're not getting an active intervention, then that certainly could end up influencing access to medical care and health behaviors that would influence, outcomes, and that could then affect mortality. So mortality would not be, I don't see how mortality would be free of some of the concerns that are being raised about not having a placebo control.
Okay, well, we'll thank our speakers, and I think if I don't use all the next session's time, we better break. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.